Okay, so time to use our user object. And the question, of course, is where do I want to use my user object? Well, I want to use that user object when creating a new product, right? When saving a product, I want to store a reference to a user here, or embed the entire user data, as you learned. However, for products and users, you could actually find arguments for both approaches here. You certainly don't want to enclose all the user data in an embedded document, because that would mean that if the user data changes, you need to change that data in all products. But if you do include something which is unlikely to change very often, like the user name, for example, well, then you could certainly go ahead and embed that together with the ID, so that you always have that ID to fetch more data about the user if you need to. You got a find by ID method in the user model after all. Or that you have at least some snapshot data, like the username, available immediately. If that should change, you need to update it everywhere. The alternative to this is that you just store the ID, so just a reference, and therefore if you need connected data, you always have to fetch it manually from 2 collections. But on the other hand, you might not do that too often. And therefore here, indeed, when I fetch the products, I don't really need the user data. We're not displaying the user name anywhere in our app. So I actually just want to store the user ID so that we know who is connected, even though we're not fetching that a lot. Now, what does this mean for our application here, though? Well, it means that when creating a new product, we can pass the user ID. We can accept the user ID here. So this user ID is equal to user ID. We store this as a property of our product now. And with that, we have all we need in the product model. Now we need to make sure that we do pass that user data when creating a product. So in the admin.js controller, when adding new products, here I want to pass null for the product ID because we don't have that when creating a new product. But for the user ID, I want to pass the ID of the user, which, as you know, we now store in our request. We do this in the app.js file, right? We have that middleware, which we set up in an earlier module, where we find that user and where I then store that user in our request. Now, this is a bit of a constructed example because I'm storing it just to extract the ID, which I hard-coded here. So we could just hard-code it into our code anyways. But the idea here, of course, is to show you how you can extract the user in one central place and then reuse it in any other route. And that is the idea here. Later, once we added authentication, we'll manage that user a bit differently. So for now, we just have that user object in the request, and therefore in the admin.js controller, here I can access request user and then underscore ID, which will be just a string here, because when retrieving data, the object ID is converted to a string for us. So we have just the string here. Now with that, we should actually store the user ID when creating a new product. Let me first of all delete that old product, and then let's quickly add a new product here. And I get an error that I can't read property ID of undefined. And this should be coming from inside our admin.js file here when I try to access my user underscore ID. So something seems to be going wrong here. I'm storing the request user here though. Let's go to the user model, find by ID. Let's add then and catch here. And catch any error we might be getting when fetching that user. And here I'll also console log the user object I'm getting right before I return it again. And with that, let me try to reload the admin product, add product page. And I now get an error. We did retrieve the user here, but then I sent duplicate headers by the look of it. Because I've been calling next too often here in app.js. Since I added the other code again, I don't need to call next at the bottom of it. So let's save that to not call next too often. Let's now reload this page here. And now I just fetched the user with the ID, which is a string here. So that is actually valid. Now let me try adding this again. And now this works. So it was that error with the double next. So now if we have a look at our products here, we see that products now also have a user ID, which is just a reference pointing at the user who did create that product, which is one way of establishing relations the way you already know from MySQL, of course. This is not an embedded document, but here the argument simply is when we're fetching products, we don't really need any user information, hence we do it just like that. This, of course, will change once we start storing orders. There you could say it does make sense to store information about the user, for example, the email at least. And for the product, you want to store the title and the price maybe. So there it makes sense to suddenly aggregate this together. Speaking of that, why don't we work on cart items and orders next?